Hello, my name is Vincent Covello, and in this segment I would like to share with you basic information about how to produce a message map. A message map is a tool, but it's a tool for achieving message clarity and conciseness, particularly when we're using them for the purposes of public health emergencies and crises. It's also a roadmap. It's a roadmap for displaying detailed, hierarchically organized information related to anticipated issues, questions, or concerns. And finally, you can think of a message map as a visual aid, something that provides us at a glance the organization's messages for a high concern or a controversial issue. One of the basic assumptions of message mapping that has been actually validated in dozens of studies is that most of the questions and concerns that people have related to a public health emergency or crisis can be anticipated in advance. This includes for the public at large as well as for individual stakeholders, such as questions and concerns that journalists would ask. One of the classics in the literature is the 77 questions commonly asked by journalists in a disaster that was the basis in part for 9/11 and the Q's and A's that took place then. There have been many other studies that indicated that 95% of the questions and concerns for virtually every major state crisis can be anticipated in advance. The message map, this is a simple figure that shows what a message map looks like. It would be produced for a particular issue, crisis event, emergency. As you see at the very top, it starts off with the stakeholder, the question or concern, and then moves its way in blocks of threes with key messages and supporting facts. If you'd like examples of message maps produced either using the box format that I just showed you or the bullet format, which is an alternative format used by many agencies, there are various places you can go. For example, you could Google CDC, look at their message maps on pandemicflu.gov. You could look at the state health directors and their message maps on Ebola. You could also go to the EPA's website and look at their message maps dealing with water contamination. You might even want to take a look at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's message maps dealing with a radiological event. The primary goals of a message map are to organize information in an easily understood and accessible framework. What we're attempting to do in a message map is express the viewpoints of the organization on important issues, concerns, and questions. And we're also trying to promote internal dialogue because the message map allows us to all get together and focus our attention on what are the issues, concerns, and what are our messages. And typically a message map team includes three individuals, or at least representing three different perspectives. The scientific perspective, to make sure that we're having a dialogue with the scientists to make sure, for example, among other things, the information is accurate. The second is we want a communicator there, one who is a expert or very familiar with the risk and crisis communication literature on how to develop effective messages. They would offer their perspective on the messages. And finally, typically we would have as part of a message mapping team this dialogue. We want to dialogue with those involved in management and policy, which might even include the legal perspective. Why? Because typically a message has implications for both policy management and the legal structure of the organization. If I expand the goals of message maps, the literature actually identifies 8 separate goals that we're attempting to achieve through the message mapping process. It begins by identifying as comprehensively as possible the stakeholders very early in the communication process, those for which we would like to engage, have a dialogue. It means we also want to anticipate as much as possible, as comprehensively as possible, the stakeholder questions and concerns that they will bring to our attention. Third is we want to organize our thinking about how we would respond to these types of anticipated concerns or questions. Once we've thought through and brainstormed it, we want to develop key messages and supporting information that is, these are the basic criteria: clear, concise, transparent, accessible. As I mentioned earlier, we want to use the message map as a way by which to promote dialogue, both internal within the organization, among scientists, among communicators, among policymakers, the legal community. But we also want to use this as an opportunity to encourage dialogue, for example, with our partners and actually with stakeholders themselves. It provides also a user-friendly way for a spokesperson to use as I mentioned before, a tool, a roadmap, a visual aid to help them to prepare for questions they might receive from various stakeholders. It becomes a repository, an archive of information that can be continually updated. It can be passed on from person to person, institution to institution, so that messages that have been developed in the past, we're not reinventing wheels. And finally, it encourages the organization to speak with one voice, and if we can't speak with one voice, at least we're in harmony with one another. This is a quote from one of the leading experts in risk and crisis communication, Baruch Fishoff from Carnegie Mellon University in Pennsylvania. And the quote goes, "In an emergency, our future may hang on a few words, provided by someone in authority as we face a fateful decision." And the message map is one of the devices by which to achieve that goal. So there are 7 major steps involved in message mapping, and this particular topic is of great interest to me. Over the past 30 years, I've been involved in a large number of message mapping efforts, both in terms of planning for a risk or a crisis situation or actually responding to it. So the 7 steps begin with identifying the issue, the crisis communication scenario, event for which we'd like to have message maps available. We want to try to do this as comprehensively as possible so that we can cover the full range of vulnerabilities of a city, a town, a hospital, or a school, or any other facility that might be involved in an emergency or crisis. So we try to be as comprehensive as possible, looking at the different scenarios for which we'd like to have maps produced. The second step in the process is to identify the stakeholders, those that would be interested or affected by the issue. The third step in the process is to identify a comprehensive list of questions and concerns that stakeholder would have about the issue. The fourth step is to develop the key messages in response to those concerns or questions from the stakeholder. Then we want to develop the supporting information. We want to be more than simply a soundbite. We want to be able to elaborate, provide more detailed information, drill down into the message map so that we provide more information. In many ways, the message map is a tip of an iceberg of the information we have available in order to respond to a question or concern from a stakeholder in a crisis or emergency situation. Then we want to do testing. I'll chat later about the importance of testing because many times we think we have the best message and we find out in testing either from partners or from the stakeholders that it's not the best message after all. And finally, we want to plan for delivery. How do we share these messages with others? How do we what communication channels do we use? Do we use social media? Do we use traditional media? Do we use press releases, fact sheets? What are the best ways by which to impart the information on those who want the information? With that in mind, there's a variety of different steps. As I mentioned, step 1 is fundamental. What are the issues for which we'd like to have message maps? And once we've decided on those issues, we move into step 2, which is who are the stakeholders involved or affected by the issue. The stakeholders, there actually could be, in many cases, almost an infinite number of stakeholders because of the nature of an emergency or crisis. We typically start off the stakeholder list with the public at large and the media, but the public is made up of different parts of the public, which includes, for example, among other things, employees. We want to make sure that we have messages that are appropriate for the regulatory agencies that may be involved. We want to have message maps prepared for citizen or activist groups, for the medical community, for healthcare facilities, for parents, for students, for example, if it's involved in a school. Each of these become important for the purposes of making sure we're as comprehensive as possible. The stakeholder perceptions are important because, number one, in terms of their concerns, is because their perceptions will largely determine the outcome of the issue. They will also have a profound impact on the perceptions of success in handling the crisis. And finally, we do want to make sure that we adapt the messages to different stakeholders because they will have different information needs. In terms of types of questions that people will typically have, different parts of the public, it starts off with basic questions about health and safety. Then it may move on to environmental or ecological impacts, economic impacts, quality of life impacts, concerns and questions, equity, fairness issues, but also might include a large number of other types of concerns, such as cultural or symbolic or historical, legal or regulatory concerns. Might go back to the very basics and basic informational concerns: who, what, where, when, why, how, the 5 W's and the 1 H. People might have questions about openness, honesty, transparency, access to information, accountability. What are the options available? What alternatives are being considered? Let alone questions about to what degree is the issue under control, or are we being asked to do things involuntarily or being imposed upon us? What are the benefits of the suggested remedies? Let alone fundamental questions about trust, such as are you honest, open, transparent, caring, empathetic, competent, expert, wise in your decision making? The ideal structure of a message map starts off with 3 key messages. This allows us to achieve the goal of conciseness. We want to be able to deliver those 3 key messages in a very brief amount of time. Typically, we're looking for an average of no more than or no less than 9 seconds. And we want to use three messages delivered in 9 seconds in 27 words for the entire set of messages, as opposed to simply one message. Ideally, these messages, these 27 9-3 messages, would be created in advance for whatever question or concern we anticipate will be asked. Simple is best. Simpler, actually, the more effective, although there's a limit to simplicity before we start distorting the information. The messages should be targeted to the audience, the intended audience. We often start, if we have no other information available, at the 6th to 8th grade, although I should mention that might vary. The general rule of thumb is we take the average grade level of the audience, subtract 4 grade levels. That's one of the reasons why, for example, USA Today, writing about the same issue, may be written very differently than the article about on the same issue for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, because they're writing for different audiences. And we also want to make sure that we've limited or at least avoided the use of acronyms, technical words. About the only 3 words that I would feel comfortable in terms of acronyms are FBI, CIA, and IRS. That's about it. Beyond that, you have to be very careful that acronyms would not be understood. Again, in terms of the structure of the message map, you saw this sample before, but it begins with the stakeholder and the question or concern. You would put that at the very top of the message map. Then you would move on to the 3 key messages, key message 1, key message 2, where you would insert the messages in response to the question or concern. Ideally, those 3 messages, as I mentioned earlier, should add up to no more than 27 words that can be expressed in 9 seconds. Then you want to provide the support, and the support typically takes the form of additional facts or proofs that elaborate on the key messages, but they might be a visual, they might be a credible third party, an analogy, even a story could become part of the message map. Step number 4 is to develop these key messages that we're making sure that the narrative is responding to the concerns of the audience. One of the concerns in communication is that we get a question for which we're not really providing the answer. Sometimes you see this in politics, where someone gets a question and they give an answer that really is not a response to the question itself. As I said, we want to keep them simple and short. Just to push that a little bit further, there's a basic theory in risk and crisis communication called mental noise theory. Mental noise theory starts off with the basic hypothesis that when people are stressed and upset, such as in a risk or crisis situation, they will have difficulty processing information. And this reduces substantially the ability of people to process information related to an issue or concern. Some of the challenges are to overcome the mental noise, the emotion that a risk or crisis may create. At the same time, as we're simplifying information, we want to make sure that we haven't simplified it to such an extent that it's no longer accurate. This often results in compromises between the scientists and the communicators. They would like to have as detailed and accurate and precise information as possible, but the communicator is striving for simplicity and clarity. Within the constraints imposed, often this results in a compromise, but nonetheless a compromise that meets the basic goals of message mapping. Some of the particular solutions to message mapping include, as I mentioned earlier, a limited number of messages, 3 messages, or an alternative would have one key message with 3 parts. There's a number of ways by which to construct that. You can simply say, yes, that's true, and let me share with you the reasons why, and you would have 3 reasons why. Or you can share the 3 reasons why, for example, something has happened or not happened. You want to keep it, again, within that 9 seconds, 27 words, 3 messages for brevity. And the general rule of thumb is we start off, again, at the 6th to 8th grade level. Supporting information, I like to think of supporting information as what's below the surface on the tip of an iceberg that we're able to drill down into whatever depth satisfies the stakeholder or the concerns that are being expressed. We start simple, but typically the second level of a message map goes up about 4 to 8 grade levels, and then the last level of a message map might be a third level through hyperlinks, which actually provides information that only a technical expert would understand. In terms of testing, the first testing is by the message map team. It's reviewed by the scientist. I mentioned earlier that a message map team might consist of a scientist who's looking at accuracy primarily, the communicator who's looking at clarity and brevity, the policy manager who's looking at whether or not it's consistent with policies and implications for the organization overall. When you go beyond the experts who produce the message map, which is part of the review because they're reviewing it from their perspective, then you would share it with others in the organization who are close to the issue, and you keep moving out a little bit like a stone in a puddle. It moves out in ripples that you keep testing further and further out until eventually you're testing with partners and with the stakeholder themselves. When you're planning for delivery, which is step number 7, one of the questions you want to ask is who would be the most trusted source of information about that issue. Sometimes it's the organization that's producing the message map. Sometimes it might be an intermediate organization, such as happened in Latin America, where we were using the churches as a way by which to share information about pandemic influenza. Then you have to decide who would be the spokesperson. If it's being delivered orally, who would be the spokesperson? Would it be the head of the organization or someone lower down? Often that depends on what are called risk perception factors. The higher the concern, the higher the level would be the spokesperson. And of course, we have the public information officer available to us either as a spokesperson or to support the lead spokesperson on an issue. And finally, we have to decide what's the best way to communicate the information, given all the hundreds of different delivery channels from websites, fact sheets, hotlines. We can use social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. We can use traditional fact sheets as a way by which to share information, let alone face-to-face communication. All of these are ways by which we might most effectively deliver. Each of them has a separate literature associated with it. What are the cost, risk, and benefits associated with each method of delivery? You can also use message maps to bridge back to the key messages. It's the difference between what's called a question-driven communication and answer-driven communication. That we should have a key message in mind, something that we want people to take away, the go-to information. Sometimes in the military it's called the bluff, the bottom line up front. What is it that is the bottom line? And the message map can be a very effective device by which to remind the spokesperson about what are the key messages that I would like people to take away from the communication. There's various types of ways by which to what's called bridging or redirection. It might start off with, after you've shared a detailed message map, you might finish up by saying, however, the real issue here is, or what's most important, remember, or let me try to put this in perspective by reminding you of what I said before, or let me emphasize the important point, or what this all boils down to as ways by which to bring us back to where we want people to be in terms of understanding of the issue. Finally, if you'd like more information about message mapping, I'd encourage you to look at the literature. There's a very large literature now on message mapping. Over 50 agencies around the world have adopted message mapping as a way by which to archive answers to anticipated questions. I mentioned several earlier, such as the CDC, the EPA, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, as just examples of organizations, let alone the state health directors on Ebola. But if you would like more information about this, I encourage you to go to the Drexel archive and database and library on risk and crisis communication. So with that, I want to thank you very much for joining me in this session.